It's kind of wild to think about, but you have more freedom, more entertainment, and just more instant access to pleasure than any human being in the history of the world.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right, like by all historical metrics, if we're just looking at the raw data of human comfort, you should be absolutely ecstatic.
You think so, yeah.
But so why are you and, nearly everyone around you feeling so incredibly anxious and isolated?
That is the big question.
It really is. So welcome to the deep dive. For you listening right now, our dedicated learner who prefers to look under the hood of culture rather than just accepting the surface narrative, we're setting out on a very specific mission today.
We definitely are.
We are going to cut straight through the noise of the digital age to examine this really dense, highly provocative source text. It's titled How Pornography and Sex Became a Death Cult.
Yeah. And, I mean, it is a jarring title.
Extremely jarring.
Right, but I can tell you the material inside does not pull any punches. It's this sweeping sociological and psychological autopsy of the modern mind.
Autopsy is like the absolute perfect word for it. Because our mission today is to unpack this profound philosophical argument about how modern society has somehow managed to entangle our deepest life-affirming drives with, well, our most self-destructive impulses.
Right. And the author argues that this entanglement has basically left an entire generation totally starved for meaning.
Exactly. Now, before we take a single step further, I want to make sure we lay down some absolute ground rules for this deep dive.
Very important, yeah.
Because the source material we're examining, it touches on highly charged, incredibly sensitive political and religious themes. I mean, the author launches critiques at everything from left-wing cultural and secular movements to right-wing extremism, and even takes these deep dives into various religious fundamentalist ideologies.
They really go after everyone.
They do. So I want to assure you, the listener, that we are not taking sides today. We are not endorsing the author's viewpoints, and we aren't, acting as critics trying to tear them down either.
No, not at all.
We're simply acting as your neutral guides, mapping out the fascinating, complex, and honestly, sometimes really alarming arguments presented in the text.
And what's fascinating here is that the text acts as a sort of psychological mirror. We're purely looking at the framework the author uses to explain these extreme cultural shifts.
Right, the architecture of it.
Exactly. We want to understand the architecture of their argument, completely regardless of where anyone stands on the political or religious spectrum.
So, keeping that completely neutral lens intact, let's go back to that core question. Why does a society drowning in pleasure feel so empty?
Well, the text claims that to answer this, we have to recognize we're in the middle of a profound crisis of meaning.
Okay.
And to explain the actual mechanics of this crisis, the author reaches back to a pair of fundamental Freudian concepts that we really need to define first.
Let's do it.
We have Eros on one side and Thanatos on the other.
Okay, let's start with Eros, because I feel like pop culture has done a massive disservice to this term.
Oh, completely.
We hear Eros and we immediately think of like eroticism or purely physical sex or, romance novels.
Right, but in classical psychoanalytic and philosophical terms, Eros is the foundational life-affirming drive.
Like the drive to live.
Yeah, it's the human impulse for connection, for binding things together. It's the energy that makes an artist want to paint a canvas, or the drive that makes people want to form communities and build cities.
Or leave a legacy.
Exactly. A legacy that outlasts their physical existence. It is the fundamental spark of life itself.
So it's basically the ultimate creative force.
Yeah.
Okay, so if Eros is the builder, what is Thanatos?
Thanatos is the shadow. It's the unconscious drive toward death, destruction, and, well, a return to nothingness.
Wow, okay.
So if Eros wants to bind things together, Thanatos wants to tear them apart. You see it in, like a toddler who builds a magnificent tower of blocks, only to violently smash to pieces a second later.
Oh, right. Yeah, I've seen that.
In adults, it manifests as the impulse that pulls us toward self-sabotage, aggression, the dissolution of personal boundaries, and ultimately annihilation.
So we have these two opposing forces.
Yes, and the author's core thesis rests on the idea that in a healthy functioning culture, these two immense psychological forces are kept in check and guided by a third critical element, which is logos.
Okay, let's define logos for the listener. We're talking about the ancient Greek concept, right? Usually translated as reason, truth, or a higher moral order.
Yes, exactly. Logos is the structural framework. Whether a society gets its logos from civic philosophy, traditional religion, or just a shared ethical consensus. It's the compass that tells the culture what human life is actually for.
Right.
And the Synthesizes argues that modern moral relativism, the idea that there's no objective truth, only like your personal truth and my personal truth, has completely eroded logos.
So we've dismantled the compass.
We have systematically dismantled the traditional frameworks that used to give human desire a direction.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second, because if you remove logos, you don't just achieve this utopian state of total blissful freedom.
No, not at all.
You disrupt the fundamental balance of the human psyche. If I'm reading the text's mechanical argument correctly, without a moral compass, Eros becomes degraded.
Yes.
It stops being about building deep, lasting connections and just gets reduced to empty, commodified lust. It becomes totally transactional.
That's the exact sequence.
And because the life drive is suddenly weakened and hollowed out like that, Thanatos, that destructive impulse, just rushes in to fill the vacuum.
Right.
It pulls disaffected people toward nihilism, despair, and eventually these extreme apocalyptic ideologies.
That is precisely what the author describes.
Yeah.
When the life drive loses its meaning, the death drive becomes the dominant operating system of a culture.
Is it sort of like taking a teenager, sitting them in the driver's seat of a really high-performance sports car, and just putting a brick on the gas pedal?
I love that analogy.
Right, so the engine is roaring, you have this pure kinetic energy, that's Eros, but then you completely rip the steering wheel out of the dashboard.
And the steering wheel is logos.
Exactly. You haven't made the teenager free, you've basically guaranteed they're going to crash into a brick wall at 100 miles an hour.
Yeah.
And that spectacular crash, that inevitable destruction, that's Thanatos.
The mechanics of that analogy are spot on, but if we connect this to the bigger picture the author is painting, we have to realize that the GPS in that sports car is actively routing them toward the cliff.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. To illustrate what happens to a population living in this state of directionless velocity, the text brings in the 20th century political philosopher Hannah Arendt.
Right, the totalitarianism expert.
Exactly. She studied the origins of totalitarianism, and she issued a warning that feels incredibly relevant to the author's point here. Arendt warned that the ideal subject of a totalitarian regime isn't the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist.
Then who is it?
The ideal subject is the person for whom the distinction between fact and fiction and true and false no longer exists.
Because if nothing is objectively true, if there is no logos, then absolutely nothing matters.
Right.
You can't even argue against tyranny because you don't even believe in the concept of a shared reality anymore.
And the human psyche has a terrifyingly low tolerance for total meaninglessness. We just cannot sit comfortably in the void.
They freak out.
We do. When a society strips away objective truth, people panic. They feel that terrifying loss of the steering wheel. And in that state of panic, they will embrace almost anything.
Like a doomsday narrative.
Yeah, a doomsday narrative, a rigid punishing ideology, or a full-blown death cult, just to feel the relief of structure again.
Yeah.
They're so starving for logos that they will gladly swallow a toxic counterfeit if the authentic version has been erased.
Okay, so if we accept this overarching philosophical crisis, this collision between the life drive and the death drive in a world without a steering wheel, we have to look at where this crisis actually takes root in a person's life. Because it doesn't just start when you're 40, it starts in the cradle of the digital age. We have to talk about how childhood and adolescence are being completely rewired.
Yeah, the author shifts from these grand metaphysical concepts down to the brutal, everyday reality of modern youth. And there is a stark claim made early in the text.
What's the claim?
That screams have essentially replaced human caregivers as surrogate mothers.
Surrogate mothers. That is heavy.
It is. We are looking at an environment where half of all teenagers report feeling genuinely addicted to their devices, checking their phones on average 50 times a day.
50 times a day? I mean, think about the neurology of that for a second. That is not a tool you pick up to check the weather.
No, it's not.
That is a behavioral loop. That is literally a rat pressing a lever for a pellet 50 times between breakfast and bedtime.
And the text argues that this constant pacifying screen time creates an infantilized mindset.
How so?
Well, a human mother eventually pushes a child to be independent, right? To face the friction of the real world.
Yeah, you have to grow up.
But the algorithm, the digital surrogate mother, does the exact opposite.
Yeah.
It wants to keep the user in a state of perpetual dependency. It feeds them this frictionless diet of micro-entertainment that just fractures their attention span.
Wow.
And this state of digital pacification keeps young people emotionally stunted, which makes them highly vulnerable to ideological capture later on.
Here's the paradox that I found so fascinating in the text. The technology is keeping them emotionally infantilized, but at the exact same time, the broader culture is screaming at them to be hyper-individualistic.
Oh, absolutely.
The text spends a lot of time tearing down the modern cultural mantra of be yourself, which, I mean, on the surface feels really counterintuitive.
It does.
Isn't be yourself supposed to be the ultimate positive message?
Yeah.
Like, it's the theme of every children's movie, every pop song, every influencer's bio. How can the author frame that as a negative?
So the text leans heavily on the work of philosophers like Byung-Chul Han and Charles Taylor to dismantle that exact assumption. They argue that in a hyper-consumerist, digitally mediated culture, the demand to be authentic is actually a highly sophisticated trap. Han observes that under modern digital capitalism, the self is no longer a private, developing soul.
What is it then?
It becomes a marketable commodity. You are expected to be the producer, the PR manager, and the product of your own identity.
It makes me think of an analogy of like a retail storefront.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So the culture tells a teenager that their only job is to decorate the window display of their personal brand. So they spend hours curating the perfect aesthetic, editing the photos, adopting all the right buzzwords to signal their identity.
Break the perfect image.
They want the window display to look perfectly authentic. But because society has told them to reject any deeper traditions, religions, or philosophies that might actually build character, the store inside is completely empty.
That's a great way to put it.
There's nothing on the shelves. It's literally all window dressing.
And Charles Taylor points out the incredible fragility of that empty store. We are instructed to form this autonomous self completely in a vacuum, stripped of any external roots.
Which is impossible.
It is. A self formed without a transcendent purpose is incredibly hollow. Because it has no intrinsic weight, no internal logos telling it that it has inherent value, it is perpetually starving for outside validation to prove it even exists.
Like it needs constant feeding.
Exactly. Likes, retweets, and algorithmic clout become the literal only proof of life.
And the text brings the receipts on what this actually does to a generation. It highlights this staggering statistic. 1 in 5 U.S. adolescents now report symptoms of anxiety and depression.
It's heartbreaking.
It really is. Furthermore, the data shows that youth who place a high value on material wealth and the accumulation of things, which is, the ultimate physical expression of this commodified branded self, they're much more likely to suffer from severe social isolation.
Right.
We basically equate success with accumulating digital validation, and it is breeding a terrifying level of withdrawal.
You're promised infinite freedom to curate your identity. But the identity you build requires constant, exhausting feeding from the algorithm just to survive.
Right. And because that self is left so hollow and so desperate for a dopamine hit just to feel alive, it becomes the absolute perfect target for systems that are engineered to exploit that exact desperation.
Definitely.
If a teenager is a vacuum of meaning, something is going to rush in to fill it. And the text points directly to the darkest corners of the digital economy. So we're moving from the hollow self to what the author calls the pornographic prophets.
Yeah, this is where the sociological analysis really intersects with the hyper-sexualization of modern culture. The author describes a new catechism preached in pixels.
A catechism preached in pixels.
Remember our discussion about the removal of logos. When traditional moral frameworks are dismantled, human desire isn't magically liberated into some beautiful, free-flowing utopia.
Right, it doesn't just float free.
No, instead, desire is immediately captured by algorithms. These platforms dictate what we want, turning pornography into a profound mechanism of psychological conditioning and behavioral control.
The text cites a study here that absolutely stopped me in my tracks. It shows that 88% of popular pornographic films depict physical assault against women.
Yeah, 88%.
88%. That is not some dark web niche category. That is the mainstream baseline that millions of people are clicking on every single day.
It is the standard.
And the text argues that this is fundamentally rewiring the viewer's brain, often from an incredibly young age, teaching them to equate human intimacy with dominance, aggression, and raw consumption.
If we connect this back to our overarching theme, this is the total triumph of Thanatos. And the author introduces a heavily loaded concept here, which is eschatological erotica.
Let's break that phrase down for a
Yeah.
second, because eschatological refers to theology concerning the end of the world, the final judgment, the apocalypse. And erotica is obviously the realm of sexual desire. To fuse those two ideas together feels deeply, deeply contradictory.
It is contradictory, which is exactly why it's so destructive. Eschatological erotica describes the subconscious psychological link between extreme, often degrading sexual indulgence and a nihilistic longing for the end of the world.
Oh, wow.
The source claims that when Eros, the life drive, is repeatedly corrupted by this hyper-violent, hyper-transactional imagery, it morphs into a destructive force.
It gets twisted.
Yes. The user experiences a satiated emptiness after the algorithmic indulgence, and that deep, hollow feeling often curdles into a desire to just see everything burned.
So because they have been trained out of the ability to find genuine vulnerable connection, the pleasure itself actually becomes a vehicle for despair.
Exactly.
And here is where I want to explicitly remind our listener about our neutrality ground rules, because the text makes a very provocative claim about horseshoe theory, applying this psychological framing to modern political and religious movements.
Right. The author argues that both secular left-wing utopian movements, specifically the ones that chant phrases about burning the system down to build a flawless society, and religious fundamentalist groups like extreme jihadist organizations, they share the exact same underlying death drive structure.
According to the psychological diagnosis, anyway.
Yes, according to the text.
Yeah.
Both extremes have allowed Thanatos to take the wheel.
Yeah.
Both are entirely willing to sacrifice the present tangible world, to literally destroy it in order to usher in an imagined, pure fantasy utopia.
So they view destruction as a good thing.
They view the destruction of the current order not as a tragedy, but as a necessary, almost ecstatic purging fire.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the text grounds this massive geopolitical idea in a very intimate biological reality. The author points out the French term for orgasm, which is la petite mort.
Which translates literally to the little death.
The little death, right. Historically, in literature and philosophy, that little death of the ego during intimacy is supposed to be a bonding experience. It is a moment of intense vulnerability that leads to a rebirth of love and connection between two people. But the text suggests a dark mutation has occurred.
It definitely has.
When this biological release is hijacked by degrading algorithms and violent imagery, it ceases to be a bonding experience entirely. It becomes a solitary ritual of nihilism. You are neurologically training the brain to link the highest peak of physical pleasure with emptiness, domination, and destruction.
It's the ultimate perversion of Eros. And to prove that this isn't just a hypothetical critique of modern internet habits, the text provides some chilling historical case studies in its appendix.
Right.
The author points to the Manson family and the Heaven's Gate cult to show how this mechanism has always operated, even way before broadband internet.
I want to spend some time here because the contrast between those two cults perfectly illustrates the author's point about horseshoe theory. How did Charles Manson manipulate Eros and Thanatos?
Manson is the prime example of weaponized indulgence. He used orgiastic, drug-fueled environments to systematically break down the personal boundaries and traditional morality of his followers.
He flooded their systems.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He gave them sensory overload until their individual egos completely dissolved. And once he had totally untethered their Eros from any moral logos, he seamlessly redirected that chaotic, unanchored energy into a murderous, apocalyptic vision of a race war.
He used pleasure to manufacture killers.
Yes.
And then you look at Heaven's Gate, which operated in the exact opposite manner, but arrived at the exact same destination.
Right, because Heaven's Gate represents the total militant repression of Eros. They forbade sexuality entirely.
I mean, they wore identical loose-fitting clothes just to hide the human form.
They did. Some of the male leadership even underwent voluntary physical castration. They embraced this extreme asceticism, viewing the human body merely as a biological container that was holding them back.
Just a vessel.
Yeah, and eventually this absolute rejection of the life drive culminated in mass suicide because they believed that destroying their containers was the only way to reach a UFO trailing the Hale-Bopp comet.
It is just a profound psychological insight. Whether it is the violent sensory indulgence of the Manson family or the sterile, suicidal puritanism of Heaven's Gate, the internal mechanism is identical. Eros is either corrupted or starved to death, and Thanatos takes absolute control of the steering wheel, driving the individual into annihilation. And the terrifying argument of the text is that our digital culture is subtly executing this exact same psychological operation on a mass scale.
It is. And this twisted relationship between pleasure, identity, and destruction doesn't just stay neatly quarantined in a private browser history.
No, it bleeds out.
It bleeds out into the public square. It mutates how we interact with our peers, how we view social justice, and how we understand empathy itself.
Right.
Which leads us into the text's critique of what it calls the cult of martyrs and the carnival of compassion.
Let's tackle the cult of martyrs first. The premise here is that because our culture has been starved of transcendent meaning, because we lack traditional avenues for heroism or spiritual sacrifice, we have started romanticizing suffering itself as a way to gain traction in the algorithm.
We have.
We have traded genuine religious or civic martyrdom for digital clout.
And the author points to several manifestations of this. You see it in the aestheticization of depression on platforms like TikTok.
Oh, yeah.
Mental illness ceases to be a clinical condition that one seeks healing for, and instead becomes a poetic fashion accessory, right? A badge of authenticity that you perform for the camera.
Like a performance.
Yeah, and you also see it in activist circles where individuals actively seek the clout of public self-sabotage, competing in a race to the bottom to be recognized as the ultimate victim or the most radical savior.
The text also extends this critique to how young people commodify their own bodies, pointing directly to platforms like OnlyFans. The cultural narrative tells a young woman that selling her intimacy online is an act of ultimate empowerment and entrepreneurial freedom. But the author flips that narrative entirely, arguing that this is actually a profound form of self-exploitation.
It's digital martyrdom.
Exactly. A digital martyrdom where the creator acts as both the high priest and the sacrificial lamb on the altar of internet commerce. And the data suggests this empowerment frequently leads to crushing loneliness and anxiety.
It does.
But, I have to push back on the text here, because I imagine a lot of listeners are thinking the exact same thing.
Sure.
Is it really fair or even accurate to label this a death cult? I mean, if someone is starting an OnlyFans to pay off student loans in a brutal economy, or if an activist is blocking traffic because they genuinely believe their cause will save lives, aren't they just navigating the modern world?
It's a valid question.
Right. How does the author differentiate between someone just trying to survive and someone who has been swallowed by this dark digital martyrdom?
So this raises a crucial philosophical distinction, and the author's answer hinges entirely on the concept of logos and the true nature of sacrifice.
Sure.
Historically, philosophically, and theologically, a true sacrifice is always directed outward.
Outward.
Yes. You sacrifice for love, for a higher objective truth for your family, or for God. It is aimed at a transcendent good. Digital martyrdom, conversely, is directed entirely inward toward the ego, or offered upward to the algorithm for transient numerical validation.
So it's the difference between a firefighter risking their life to pull someone from a burning building versus an influencer filming themselves having a public mental breakdown because they know the vulnerability will spike their engagement metrics.
Exactly.
One is an act of love, the other is performative self-destruction.
The influencer isn't sacrificing for eternal truth. They're sacrificing their privacy, their dignity, and their psychological stingulity for analytics.
So for numbers.
And the toll is quantifiable. The text notes a survey where 78% of influencers admitted to suffering mental breakdowns from the relentless, crushing pressure of chasing virality.
Wow. 78%.
To describe this dynamic, the author uses a heavy historical metaphor, comparing the social media algorithm to Moloch.
For those unfamiliar, Moloch was an ancient Canaanite and Carthaginian pagan idol. The historical texts describe this massive bronze statue with a furnace in its belly where worshippers would literally sacrifice their children in exchange for promises of prosperity or victory in battle.
It is the archetype of the insatiable god.
Right.
In the modern context, the text argues that Moloch is the algorithm. It is a blind, hungry machine that demands the time, the sanity, and the literal bodies of creators and consumers alike, offering only fleeting attention in return.
And operating right alongside this cult of martyrs is what the text calls the carnival of compassion. I have to say, I found this to be one of the most challenging, counterintuitive arguments in the whole deep dive.
It really makes you think.
It's the idea that empathy, which we universally consider a good thing, has been weaponized into a tool for virtue signaling and public destruction.
The author draws heavily here on the early 20th century writer G.K. Chesterton. Chesterton famously observed that the modern world isn't suffering from a lack of virtues, but rather from Christian virtues gone mad.
Virtues gone mad.
Yes, they have been isolated from one another and left to wander alone. The text applies this directly to today's internet culture. When you isolate A virtue like empathy from truth, reason, and justice, when you separate it from logos, it actually becomes tyrannical.
Calling empathy tyrannical sounds like an absolute oxymoron. I mean, can you break down the mechanics of how caring too much becomes a weapon?
Think of it like an autoimmune disease of the culture.
Okay.
The immune system, which is empathy, is supposed to attack infections and protect the vulnerable parts of the body. But without the regulatory T cells of reason, objective truth, and proportion, the immune system goes hyperactive.
It starts attacking healthy tissue.
Exactly. In this carnival, whoever performs the most extravagant outrage, whoever weeps the loudest for the designated victim, wins the moral high ground. Rational debate is immediately shut down because demanding evidence or nuance is framed as cold, violent, or cruel.
So it's cancel culture explained as a pathological empathy overload.
Pretty much.
A mob will dox someone, destroy their career, threaten their family, and scorch their entire reputation, and they will do it all with a righteous smile on their faces because they genuinely believe they are protecting the vulnerable.
They think they're the good guys.
It is a masquerade where staggering cruelty is draped in the soft language of care.
And the existential danger, the text argues, is that a functioning society just cannot survive on unchecked emotional extremes. When subjective feelings completely override objective facts, the social fabric tears apart.
You end up with tribal factions.
Yeah, each claiming an absolute monopoly on suffering, demanding total submission from everyone else.
This concept of sacrifice, sacrificing our sanity to the algorithmic Moloch, sacrificing each other in the carnival of compassion, it brings us to the most visceral, physical manifestations of the death drive.
It does.
The text outlines what it calls the rituals of the death drive. And shockingly, it begins in one of the most mundane places imaginable, which is the local gym.
Yeah, the author draws a direct and deeply unsettling pipeline from the obsessive gym selfie culture straight to the battlefield selfie.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second. Because lifting weights and going to the gym is universally prescribed as healthy. How on earth does taking a picture of your bicep pump equate to a ritual of self-annihilation?
Well, on a purely physiological level, it is healthy. But the text is performing a structural critique of the narcissism inherent in the fitness influencer world.
Right, the motivation behind it.
When the human body is honed, not for genuine capability, not for service to others, not for internal health, but purely for spectacle, for the digital gaze, it ceases to be a person and becomes an object.
It becomes content.
Exactly. The individual's inner spiritual life is slowly starved to death in service of maintaining a hyper-curated, muscular exterior. And the author argues that this specific brand of exhibitionism shares a psychological root with militaristic exhibitionism.
And the text provides a very specific, chilling, real-world example of this exact pipeline with a young man named Islam Yakin.
Yes. Islam Yakin was an Egyptian youth who was deeply entrenched in the online fitness community. His social media feeds were entirely dedicated to vanity posting videos about his workout routines, flexing his six-pack, asking followers to rate his physique.
So just pure, unadulterated narcissism.
Exactly. But within a startlingly short period, he was radicalized. He vanished and later reappeared in an ISIS propaganda video.
Wow.
He was doing a workout routine dedicated to the Mujahideen in Syria, wielding a machete instead of a dumbbell, offering his honed physique as a weapon for holy war.
And the visual framing of the videos was identical, right?
Yes, the pose.
The pose, look at me, look at my power, was exactly the same. But the context shifted effortlessly from a peacetime locker room vanity project to a lethal war zone.
The boundary between the gym selfie and the battlefield selfie completely dissolved. In both instances, the young man is entranced by a pull toward death, offering his body as an idol to something larger than himself.
Whether that is the algorithm of Instagram demanding perfection or the apocalyptic ideology of a terrorist group demanding blood.
In both cases, the body is trained explicitly for sacrifice.
And if there are actors performing these sacrifices on a digital stage, well, there has to be a congregation watching them. The text calls this audience participation the sacrament of viewing, which is essentially our culture's normalized addiction to consuming horror. It refers to it as streaming the snuff.
Because we currently have unprecedented high-definition, on-demand access to the darkest elements of human behavior.
Everything is recorded.
From live-streamed mass shootings that unfold in real time, to raw combat footage from global conflicts, to viral tragedies like the infamous TikTok blackout challenge.
Where children were accidentally asphyxiating themselves for views while millions of people watched the aftermath. It's horrible.
To explain the psychology of why we can't look away, the text pulls a story from St. Augustine, written over 1,500 years ago.
Oh, the Alypius story.
Yeah. Augustine tells the story of his friend Alypius, who was dragged against his will to the gladiatorial games in Rome. Alypius sat in the stands and closed his eyes, believing his intellect and his morals made him superior to the bloodthirsty crowd.
He thought he was above it.
But when a gladiator fell and the crowd roared in ecstasy, Alypius opened his eyes. Augustine writes that the moment he saw the blood, he drank deep of the savagery.
Wow.
It became a parasitic disease on his soul. He lost his moral high ground instantly and became addicted to the violence.
I have to pause here and ask you, the listener, to really internalize that ancient story. How different is Alypius from us? We sit alone in our bedrooms, illuminated by the glow of a smartphone, doom-scrolling through an endless algorithmic feed of war footage, car crashes, street fights, and public humiliations.
And we tell ourselves we are just staying informed or observing human nature.
Exactly. The delivery mechanism has changed from the Colosseum to the iPhone, but the psychological mechanism is identical, and the scale is infinitely larger.
It's global.
The text argues that by constantly consuming this trauma, we aren't just innocent bystanders gathering data, we are actively participating in a dark ritual. Every view, every click, every second we let the video loop is a silent endorsement.
We become passive accomplices.
We really do. We participate in a digital liturgy of nihilism that systematically deadens our empathy and makes normal, quiet, everyday life feel impossibly boring.
And the dynamic gets even darker when we examine how this violence is socialized and gamified in the obscure corners of the internet. The test refers to this phenomenon as the communion of code.
The communion of code.
We're talking about extreme internet forums, message boards like 4chan, where irony and meme culture are weaponized as an actual liturgy to radicalize isolated youth.
What's fascinating here is the precise mechanics of radicalization through humor. Because memes operate as a highly efficient, fast-moving, in-group language.
They do.
On these extreme boards, violently racist, misogynistic, or nihilistic ideologies are wrapped in absurd pop culture aesthetics. It is designed to feel like a massive inside joke.
The irony acts as a spoonful of sugar that helps the poison of extremism go down smoothly.
Right. If a 14-year-old sees a manifesto about race war, they might reject it immediately. But if they see that same hateful ideology pasted over an image of SpongeBob or Pepe the Frog, their neurological defenses are lowered.
It bypasses the filter.
The format dictates the reaction. It's just a joke. It's edgy humor.
But prolonged exposure inside these algorithmic echo chambers normalizes the extreme. The psychological distance between posting a joke about violence and committing actual violence begins to shrink rapidly.
It closes the gap.
The text points to the horrific example of the 2019 Christchurch Mosque massacre in New Zealand. The perpetrator, Brenton Tarrant, was heavily active on these boards, and after the massacre, he was literally canonized by the users.
Canonized. They were using explicit religious terminology.
Yes, they gamified the mass murder. They tracked his high score, they referred to him as a saint, and they called future copycat shooters his disciples.
It's sickening.
The forum operates as a literal church of Thanatos. The memes serve as the hymns, the manifestos are the sacred scripture, and the violence is the sacrament.
And the heavy layer of irony allows the users to distance themselves from the very real horror they are consuming.
Until inevitably one of them steps away from the keyboard, walks out the front door, and turns the digital hate into real-world bloodshed.
It is a terrifying claustrophobic diagnosis of a society in absolute freefall. I mean, we have traced the path from the loss of the moral compass to the hollowing out of the self to algorithmic pornography, the weaponization of empathy, and literal digital death cults.
It's a heavy journey.
If you are listening to this and feeling a profound sense of dread, you are not alone. But the author does not leave us to rot at the bottom of the abyss. Having thoroughly diagnosed the illness, we must ask, how does the text propose we pull ourselves out?
Which brings us to the final movement of the argument, the ascent and the difficult work of reclaiming meaning.
Because the author is adamant that this descent into nihilism is not an inevitable evolutionary endpoint, right?
Exactly. The antidote to radicalization isn't just tweaking the algorithm or enacting better content moderation. It requires a radical return to reality.
A structural shift.
It requires the hard, intentional work of integrating Eros, ours, our life, drive back with logos, our moral reason. The text outlines 3 distinct, profound solutions to begin this ascent.
Let's walk through them one by one. The first solution is revisiting a philosophical framework known as the theology of the body.
So this concept was originally developed in a massive series of lectures by Pope John Paul II and later expanded upon by Pope Benedict XVI. It directly addresses the crisis of the physical form that we see in both pornographic commodification and extreme Puritanism.
Right.
The theology of the body argues forcefully that the human body is not a mere object to be optimized and used for fleeting pleasure, nor is it a corrupt biological cage that the spirit needs to fear or escape from.
So it serves as a total rejection of both the OnlyFans extreme of total commodification and the Heaven's Gate extreme of total bodily hatred.
Precisely. It charts a middle path by elevating the physical form. It frames the body as a sacred vessel inherently designed for communion.
For connection.
It posits that our physical selves exist to make the invisible spiritual reality of love visible in the material world. When Eros is properly aligned with logos, human sexuality is no longer a transactional commodity that leaves a person feeling used and empty.
It becomes a profound language of self-giving.
Yes, that points both people toward a transcendent truth. It restores absolute dignity to the physical form.
That shifts the perspective entirely. Instead of your body being a tool to farm engagement on Instagram or a machine to maximize pleasure, it is inherently sacred.
It changes everything.
The second solution the text proposes moves from the physical body to the intellect. The author calls for a pedagogy of reality in our education systems.
Because we are living in a deeply pixelated age where the average student is bombarded with hundreds of smartphone notifications a day.
Hundreds.
This fragments their attention and deeply alienates them from the slow, tangible rhythms of the physical world. The author critiques modern education for abandoning the grand, classical questions of truth, virtue, and human purpose.
Focusing instead almost purely on technical skills and utilitarian outcomes.
Right. We are teaching kids how to be efficient cogs in a digital machine, but we aren't teaching them how to be human.
The text brings in the author C.S. Lewis here and his famous warning about creating what he called men without chests.
Yes. From Lewis's incredible book, The Abolition of Man, Lewis warned that if an education system trains the intellect without simultaneously training the moral imagination, which he called the chest, the seat of virtue, courage, and sentiment, we will produce incredibly smart but morally bankrupt people.
We train their brains but ignore their hearts.
Lewis famously wrote that we laugh at honor and then are shocked to find traitors in our midst.
Wow, that's powerful.
A pedagogy of reality means reintroducing metaphysics and classical reasoning into the classroom. It means teaching young people not just how to code an app or pass a standardized test, but why human life actually matters.
So what does this all mean in practice? How do we actually implement a pedagogy of reality? It reminds me of the analogy the text uses regarding Plato's famous allegory of the cave.
I love that part.
In the allegory, prisoners are chained facing a cave wall, watching shadows cast by a fire, genuinely believing the shadows are all that exists of reality. The author argues that modern education shouldn't be about giving the prisoners better glasses so they can analyze the shadows more clearly. It's simply about unchaining them, physically taking hold of their heads, turning them away from the digital shadows on the wall, and guiding them outside toward the actual blinding sunlight. You have to force an engagement with the friction of the real world.
Which leads perfectly into the third and final solution, what the text beautifully terms the feast of life.
I found this concept incredibly moving.
If the disease is a lonely, isolated digital nihilism, the cure must be inherently communal and physical. The text quotes the dissident Czech playwright and politician Václav Havel, who spent years fighting Soviet totalitarianism.
He wrote extensively about the power of the powerless.
He did. He argued that when you're living under an oppressive system of lies, simply choosing to live in truth, even in small, seemingly insignificant ways, is a profound act of defiance that threatens the entire system.
And the author applies Havel's political insight directly to modern community. The feast of life is the intentional act of participating in genuine, embodied community. It means inviting people into your home and sharing physical meals, not just dropping a heart emoji on their post. It's taking part in communal rituals that anchor you in time and space.
The text specifically points to the Christian Eucharist as the ultimate historical symbol of this.
Right. Gathering together to affirm that human life has objective meaning, that the material world is infused with grace, and that we belong to one another in a physical way.
It is the active choice of joyous physical connection over safe, sterile, digital isolation.
It's rebellious.
The text frames this not as mere socializing or networking, but as an act of sacred defiance against a culture of nothingness. When the algorithmic world tells you that everything is meaningless, that your body is a commodity, and that anger is the only valid emotion, gathering with friends to share food, to sing, to serve the poor in your neighborhood, or to pray, that is a revolutionary act.
It pushes back the darkness of Thanatos.
It is claiming victory in the very act of living well.
Okay, we have covered an immense, heavy amount of ground today. Let's synthesize this journey for you, our listener.
We started by identifying a society suffering from a profound crisis of meaning, where the loss of a shared moral compass logos has unleashed the destructive death drive, Thanatos.
We examined how screens and algorithmic surrogate mothers hollow out the developing self, replacing a genuine identity with a desperate, unquenchable need for digital clout.
We explored how that hollow self is preyed upon by pornographic systems that neurologically link pleasure to destruction.
And how the broader culture romanticizes suffering through a cult of martyrs and a weaponized carnival of compassion that turns empathy into a tool for destruction.
We trace the grim, real-world rituals of this death drive, from narcissistic gym selfies morphing seamlessly into terrorist propaganda to our voyeuristic consumption of suffering in the sacrament of viewing and the ironized meme liturgies that radicalize isolated youth on the dark web.
But crucially, we ended on the ascent. We recognize that by turning back toward objective truth, by honoring the physical body as sacred rather than commodified, by demanding an education rooted in reality, and by engaging in physical, real-world community, we can break this spell.
The descent into the abyss is a choice, but so is the ascent.
Exactly.
The author insists that despite the overwhelming power of the digital age, we still possess the individual agency to choose blessing over curse and life over death.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought. At the very end of the source text, there is a fascinating addendum concerning the concept of spiritual blindness.
It's a great observation.
The author notes something chilling about human nature. Lies rarely present themselves to us as obvious, ugly evils. They almost always masquerade as angels of light.
Meaning, the behaviors or systems that are ultimately the most destructive to our minds and our communities usually feel incredibly liberating, empowering, and righteous when we first encounter them.
They hide themselves in the comforting garments of common sense, self-care, or social progress. The lie is a comfortable, perfectly customized blindfold.
It really is.
So I want you to look at your own daily routines, your own closely held beliefs, your own digital habits. Think about our opening metaphor of the sports car. What is a habit, a fiercely defended ideology, or a digital space in your life that feels like ultimate freedom right now but might actually be an algorithmic blindfold keeping you in the dark? Are you actually driving the sports car, or is the algorithm driving you toward a crash?
Something to really think about.
Take a deep breath. When this audio stops, I encourage you to put the phone down, step away from the screen, leave the digital shadows on the wall behind, and go experience the real, tangible sunlight of the physical world. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.